What's up everybody? Welcome to Coding with Chaim. In this week's video, we're going to talk about building a video chat application using webRTC. So webRTC basically is a technology that allows you to basically create peer-to-peer connections using real-time communication from right within your browser without having to ever use a server. Actual communication is happening between the two peers. In other words, as we're actually having a video chat, all that communication is actually happening without the server, but actually through a peer-to-peer connection from one browser the other browser, or basically from one computer to the other one without actually having to use the server. So let's get into it. As usual, I already have all the sort of necessary starter files down in the description box below, so you can just go ahead and grab that link, clone it, and you can just follow right on along with me. And I actually already have a lot of the important boilerplate done. So the actual sort of handshake that happens between the client and the server involves a lot of Sakureo, or if you're used to working in like a different environment, like let's say you're used to working like .NET, that might involve like SignalR. But the point is there is a lot of sort of real-time communication to sort of notify the user that you're trying to call them, or that you're getting called, or that you've accepted the call, and so on and so forth. So I've kind of already handled all of that code. So I'm not going to focus on that because again, that's not the scope of this video. I really do want to just talk about mostly webRTC, and more specifically a library that exists within NPM called SimplePeer that basically wraps webRTC to kind of make things a lot simpler. So let's actually get into this. So just to kind of show you the basic flow thereafter, right here you can see that I've got one app open to localhost 3000. If I now come over here and I go to localhost 3000, as you can now see, the same exact thing happens. So if you got, you can see on the first tab, there's a video of myself. On the second tab is a video of myself. But the one thing that's now different is that in both instances, we basically have a little button down here that basically says call and then just a random ID, because I was kind of lazy. So instead of actually, creating a simple part of it where you can sort of type in a username, I basically just decided to identify each individual person that you can technically call based on their socket ID. So if I was to now go ahead and connect with another tab to localhost 3000, now you see each person has two tabs that they can call because there's two other people that are connected besides for themselves, because of course you don't actually have a button to kind of, call yourself. And so the part that I've left off and what we're going to sort of pick up together within this video is the actual part of like basically what happens once you actually click on the button to go ahead and call somebody. How are we going to notify that person that they have been called? Also, once they've actually been called, what happens when they accept the call, and then so on and so forth. Let me kind of walk you through the code that I already have that's kind of relevant to what we're doing, and then we're going to kind of go from there. As you can see here, I've already kind of jumped into the application here. So it's a simple React application. All the necessary code for the application happens in either server.js within the backend part of it, and then in the client folder, we basically have the app.js file that pretty much handles all of the necessary client-side code. And mostly, we're going to be working on filling in the call peer function, the accept call function, and then second socket that curved that on hey. So in other words, on the hey event, we're going to kind of fill in what happens here as well. So effectively, what we have is we basically have the user video, which is really this this navigator.media devices that get user media, right? So in other words, when you first come to the application, you of course want to see your own video. But in order for the browser to actually be able to sort of get your video and your audio, what it has to first do is basically ask you for permission. Now, it didn't do it for me here because I had already done it before I started recording the video. But the idea basically is that you have to actually grant permission. And you've already seen this many times, blah, blah, blah is requesting access to your video, to your microphone, or to send you notifications or that kind of thing. That's basically the same thing that happens here, right? So the navigator.media devices that get user media are basically going to be asking for the video and for the audio, as you can see right over here. And then this basically returns a promise that it will either resolve or reject depending on whether or not the person has actually granted permission for you to actually get a hold of their stream. Should they say yes, you'll come into the .then, and then you're actually going to get a hold of this stream object, which is basically a media stream object, which we then can pass to the user video. Now I'm basically using a ref over here. So I'm actually rendering the video element right over here, which is, it's got the uppercase V because it's a styled component. I just want to sort of style it so that they can kind of be positioned correctly, right? And so this is the actual user video. I had to put this property plays in line, which I actually don't know what it does, but I needed that in order for it to work. I think with iOS, I needed that to work. Muted, of course, because I don't want to hear myself when I'm having a conversation. And then I've actually set it to autoplay, so therefore I don't have to actually press play. As soon as I give it permission, it automatically starts playing my video. And the way that I can actually pass it the stream that I've gotten from the navigator.media devices, the way that I can pass it that stream is by actually passing it a ref. So I have a ref that I've created right up over here. As you can see, I created a ref calling user video by calling the useRef hook, which gives me this ref, which I then pass to the video element. And then what that allows me to then do is to come over here where I'm actually getting a hold of the user stream by asking for access to it. I can then go to the actual user video ref, go to the source object and pass it to stream. Now the reason why that's important is because the video element in HTML really has two properties that are kind of relevant here. One of them is just source, which the problem with source is that it expects it to be a string. In other words, like an actual URL that has the sort of content that you want that video tag to display. However, in our case, we're not able to do that because what we're actually being given is a sort of stream object. And so in order for us to then be able to pass it to this video element, we have to get a hold of the source objects. So that's basically the code that we have so far. A little bit more about what we have is we actually have the server keeping track of every single time that a person connects. In other words, once this actual component renders for the first time, it'll come into the use effect. And then we're basically going to go ahead and connect to the root URL within the server, which will basically trip up this IO.on connection event that's happening here within the server. This is more socket.io stuff. So again, I don't really want to, get bogged down in this too much because, you may or may not already be comfortable with socket.io, and I definitely don't want to confuse the topic. But the basic idea is that when a person actually connects, we're basically notifying the server that, hey, somebody connects and wants you to keep track of this person. And the way that the server does that is I basically created a simple users object right over here. And every single time that a person connects, I basically pass their socket ID, because every socket that you get, this socket represents a connection. A person that is actually connected to the server, it gets represented with this socket object. Each socket has a unique identifier that automatically gets generated by socket.io. And so in order for me to keep track of all the people that I have connected, I can basically just plop them in with their socket IDs. And then that's basically what allowed me to render those buttons that we saw. So there's right over here, if we come here, we basically loop over the user's object and then we get each key. And then obviously we don't want to render our own ID because we don't want to call ourselves. And then we're basically saying that for each one, basically give me a button that'll allow me to call that particular person that has that particular ID, right? And that's how that works. Again, in a real life application, this would have been something more meaningful, like an actual person's name or a username or something like that. But for the sake of brevity, I basically just use the actual ID that exists within the socket. So now one of the first things that we're going to want to do is actually go ahead and, sort of fill in this call peer function that we already have up here. Because right now, it's not really doing anything meaningful to us. So let's actually start filling it in to actually get this video chat application to work. So the first thing we're going to want to do is actually go ahead and create a peer object by calling the peer constructor. So basically new peer. Right, so we have this library installed called simple peer right over here, and then we're going to go ahead and import it. Again, this is basically a wrapper around the webRTC technology, which makes it a lot easier for us to work with it. And so this peer constructor takes in three properties. The first one is basically initiator, which is as it sounds. It basically just tells us whether or not this person is the initiator of the call. Which in this case, because we're doing this in the call peer function, we are in fact going to set initiator to be true. Trickle, which I don't know what this means, but I will just set it to false because when I was learning about this, everyone seems to set this to false. You're more than welcome to try to look into this a little bit more yourself. And then finally, we need to set the stream. Now, the stream basically is going to just be equal to the same stream that we got when we actually requested access to the user stream, when we requested access to their video as well as their audio. And this is effectively going to be what will then get streamed to the other user that you're actually making a connection with. Now, once we've done that, now we need to sort of start setting up a few events. Here.on signal. Now we're going to get the sort of signal data. Okay, so basically what happens is whenever you actually create a new peer, what the peer then tries to do is it tries to actually signal. Signaling basically means that we're trying to sort of let the other peer know what kind of capabilities this particular peer has. In other words, in order for these two peers to sort of be able to communicate with each other in real time without having to have the use of a server, they need to sort of establish some sort of connection. We can call it the handshake. And so the way that this works is one peer will basically send out a signal to the other peer. The other peer will then accept that signal, which I'm still going to demonstrate how that works. And then in turn, it'll signal its own data back to the caller. And then so this sort of round trip basically creates the handshake. And this is where socket.io will really come in handy because this is what's going to allow us to kind of send the signal data kind of like round trip. And so inside of this right over here, we're basically going to go ahead and call socket.current. Again, the socket is just a ref, which represents my actual socket, which is again is just from socket.io. So we're going to say socket.current.emit. Go ahead and emit the call user event. And when you do that, pass along the following data. In other words, who am I to call? User call, which is going to be equal to the ID that we've accepted. So as you can see here, when we call this function, right, when we're calling this function right over here, call pair, we're passing in a key. This key represents the ID of the person that we're trying to call. So we're basically going to go ahead and send that into the call pair function so that we can then send that down to the server. We're also going to send along the signal data, right? Because we need to send that to the other peer so that they can then accept sort of the incoming call. And then we also want to know who's calling you. And so we're going to do that from your ID. Now, your ID, basically, we also just keep track of on state, because when a person connects, we're basically emitting to them their own ID. And again, we're also using this to know which ID not to render when we're kind of looping through all the individual IDs, which one not to render, right? So we actually keep track of the person's ID as well. And that's where we're basically going to set the from. Okay, so that's one of the things that happens. So when we call a peer, we're creating a new peer that the initiator set to true. We're setting the stream to be equal to the stream. And then we're creating this event for when the peer signals, what do you want me to do when I'm actually signaling? And so in this case, we're capturing that signal data, sending it down to the server so that the server can then go emit it to the person that we're trying to make the phone call to, or rather the video call to. And then that other peer will then be able to accept that data and then create the handshake. Now, another thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to say peer.on stream. In other words, once we actually start getting a stream from the other peer, this stream represents the incoming data that we're getting from the person that we're sort of in communication with. What we're then going to do is we're going to say if the partner video, in other words, if the partner video ref that current already has a value, which basically means whether or not we're just basically checking to see that it's already been rendered. And if it has already been rendered, now what we're going to do is we're going to say partner video.current that source object is equal to this stream, right? So what this allows us to now do is to basically see our own video as well as the video of the person that is actually in communication with us. So we're basically going to have two sort of side-by-side videos, one that displays our own screen so we can kind of see ourselves, and then the other video right over here, this is the partner video, will basically show the data that's kind of, you know, being streamed to us from our partner here. And then it allows us to see sort of their face and kind of hear their audio, and it allows us to actually have a conversation. And finally, the last thing that we're going to want to do in the call peer function is we're basically going to want to say socket.current.on. We're basically going to have this event that's going to get emitted. It's going to be call accepted. And so this is going to get a signal in return, because remember, both of these peers have to sort of send a signal back to each other so that they can actually create the handshake. So the caller has to accept the handshake from the person who receives. So in other words, if A calls B, A sends a signal to B, B has to accept that signal, but then B has to also send a signal back to A so that A can then accept that, and now we actually have a completed handshake. So even though here I'm within the calling function, I still have to wait for the call accepted and then get the signal in return, and then finally what I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and say set call accepted is equal to true. And that's basically just setting state so that I know that the call has been accepted. But more importantly, what we're going to do is we're going to say peer.signal. There's a little method on called signal, and this accepts the actual signal. So this accepts the signal data, and now this particular peer has now accepted the incoming signal that has been sent from the person who's receiving the call. All right, so this all handles the logic of actually calling somebody else. Now let's deal with the logic of actually, receiving the call. What happens if somebody's actually calling us? As you can see here, when we're actually calling somebody, one of the things that we're doing is we're actually emitting this event call user, which on the server will basically come to this event right over here, call user. And then in turn, what that's going to do is it's going to go ahead and emit an event called hey back out to the person who we're trying to call. So we're going to basically say io.to the data that user to call. In other words, the ID of the person that we're trying to call, we're going to emit an event only to that particular socket, and that event is going to be called hey. And so back in the client-side code, we're basically saying that on the event of hey, we're going to go ahead and actually handle what happens when we're actually getting called. So first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to say set receiving call is equal to true. This will basically, allow us to know whether or not to render the message of, hey, you're actually getting a call. Then we're going to go ahead and say, we're going to set the caller of the person who's actually calling us, which is going to be equal to data.from. So this data object that we're getting back over here as part of the message, or as part of the sort of packet of data that is getting sent along with this event back from the server, it includes the person who's calling us. And then what it's also going to do is we're going to set the caller signal, and then that's going to go ahead and set, that's going to get set to data.signal. Just like that. So again, all this is really doing is just handling the fact that we are being called. This is very important. This is not yet handling the fact that we're accepting a call. This is simply to notify us that we are in fact receiving a call. And what this is going to do is basically just notify us, hey, a person is being called, you are being called by this and this person. Do you want to accept? So that will basically go ahead and render this incoming call message right over here. And so as we can see here, we have this message of like accept call, right? We have this function here passed to this button of accept call. When you click on the button, that's what's going to get called. So now we actually have to go ahead and, fill in the logic of what happens of when you actually go ahead and accept that call. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to say set call accepted to true. Now we're going to go ahead and create another peer, but this time this peer, his initiator is going to be set to false because this is now the person receiving the call. So we're going to say initiator set to false. Trickle will once again be set to false. And then stream will be equal to stream just like it was before. Okay, now we're actually going to go ahead and say peer.onSignal, much like we did before, because again, every single time that you're creating a peer, it signals. And now the question is just what do you want to do with that? So we're going to go ahead and get that data. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to take this data and we're basically going to send it back to the server to go back to the person that we're trying to, accept the call from. Because again, in order for us to have a proper handshake, each peer must accept the other peer's signal to have that proper sort of tight loop that you have the proper handshake happening, the proper connection happening. So what we're going to do is we're going to emit the event back to the server called accept call. And then what we're going to send along is going to be the signal, which basically is just this data right over here that we just got from this event. And then we're going to basically go ahead and send the message to, and who's the to? Well, that's the person who called us, which we have set in our state as caller. Okay, so now that we have that done, now we can go ahead and say peer.onStream, just like we did before. Let's go ahead and get the stream. And now what we can do with this stream is we can basically just go ahead and say partner video.current. Now again, in this case, partner video represents the other person. In other words, now we are, coming from the perspective of we are the receiving caller, and now partner video represents the person who's calling us, because of course we want to actually see the person who's calling us because we want to be able to have a conversation with them. So partner video.current.source object is equal to the stream that we are getting, right? And then finally, the last thing that we're going to do is actually go ahead and say peer.signal on the caller signal. So effectively what just happened now was this, when a person receives a call, they are signaling on the call that they've on the signal they received. They're also sending back to the server their own signal, which will then come back to this event over here of call accepted, which will receive that signal, and then this peer can kind of signal on that. So I know there's kind of a lot of ping-ponging and kind of back and forth, and they may also get confusing about the fact that there's like a lot of socket.io stuff in here, which may just kind of throw you off the scent. But I think the most important thing to take away so far from what we've discussed is as follows. Basically, we have this library called SimplePeer. In a nutshell, what SimplePeer does is it basically gives you this new peer constructor that allows you to basically pass in 3 different properties, right? The first one's initiator, the second one is trickle, the third one is stream, right? These are the sort of options that we know about that exist when you're basically constructing a new peer. Initiator basically just represents whether or not you are the caller or the one that's receiving. And whenever you're using this library, you just basically need to be able to keep track of whether or not you are in fact the caller or the receiver, and then accordingly be able to set that to either true or false. Again, trickle, I'm not sure what that is, but to stay safe, you can always just set that to false. That always seems to work. And then stream basically represents the stream that you yourself have basically are given the browser access to get. So this represents your either only video or only audio, or both your audio and your video, but whatever data you're actually trying to stream, right? And then what happens is when you actually go ahead and construct a peer object, what it's going to do is it's going to basically fire up the signal. And so what we do is we create an event handler saying that when the signal happens, give me that data. Now, you can choose to do with this whatever you want, right? Technically speaking, if you really wanted to, I've actually seen somebody do this, where they basically did the entire sort of handshake between the 2 peers without actually using a server at all. They basically took this data, wrote it out into like a text area, copy and pasted it, went to the other tab and then pasted it in there, and then just kind of did that sort of back and forth. You can technically do that. The only real important thing for you to have a successful handshake between 2 peers is to basically make sure that they each receive the other peer's signal and then actually accept that signal by calling the peer.signal method down over here. I just didn't want to have to go through the hassle of actually copying and pasting, and I just didn't feel like that was a very realistic taste of what a video application would actually look like. So I actually went ahead and built a server, and in order for me to do that, we needed to use socket.io so that we can actually have this sort of real-time communication happening back and forth of like saying, hey, you're getting a call, the call was accepted, and then in turn properly send back that signal to each individual peer so they can actually accept that signal and have a proper connection and a proper handshake happen between the 2 of them. That's pretty much it for the code. Let's actually make sure that all this runs. Let's go back to the browser. I'm going to go ahead and close all of these tabs down. Let's refresh this tab right over here. So now we can see we don't have any options to call anybody, and we just have our own individual screen up. So let's go ahead to localhost 3000 once again. And now we can see now when we go to the second tab, we actually do have a button here. And if we come back to the first tab, we now do have a button as well. So again, that button basically represents the other person that is currently connected, and you can actually go ahead and call them. So if I come back, so if I'm now on my first tab, if I click on this button right over here, I come back to my second tab, I'm now getting informed that, yada, yada, yada is actually calling you. If I click on the accept button, here we go. Now I actually have two people, and of course they're both me, so it doesn't really look much like a chat application. But in reality, we now actually have a chat application happening between both of these tabs. Well, anyways, that does it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please drop a like, subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you next week in another video.